Welcome to our session on the Strategic Plan for Personnel and Readiness. I'm Gerald Murray, Chairman of the Board for the Air Force Association, and I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker today, the Honorable Matthew P. Donovan, Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. Mr. Donovan serves as the Principal Staff Assistant and Advisor to the Secretary of Defense for Force Readiness, Force Management, Health Affairs, National Guard and Reserve Component Affairs, Education and Training, and military and civilian personnel requirements and management, including equal opportunity, morale, welfare, recreation, and quality of life matters. Secretary Donovan, that's a lot to be responsible for, but we are absolutely thrilled that you are in the seat to be able to do that. And we look forward to hearing from you today. And then with time allotting, we'll maybe be able to have a couple of questions for you to answer for us. So, sir, over to you.
Well, thank you, Chief Murray, for your lifetime of service to the Air Force and your leadership of the Air Force Association. It's great to be back with AFA, and it's a great honor to speak at your first ever virtual airspace and cyber conference. It's amazing to see how this event came together and see both AFA and the Air Force adapt so quickly to this uncharted territory. The dedication of our force to do whatever is necessary to carry out the mission always inspires me. As I've said many times, I'm proud to be an AFA lifetime member since 1981. And Gerald, when you and I first joined in 1977, we were celebrating the 30th anniversary of the U.S. Air Force. And of course, this year we're celebrating the 73rd. As I reflect back on what life was like when I was a young airman, it's interesting to think about how much has changed. Not only did I have a little more hair back then, but I remember the release of the Atari video game and lining up to see the very first Star Wars movie in theaters. A few months later, DoD launched the first Navstar Global Positioning System satellite, which was the foundation of this GPS that we all count on today. There was no doubt what we were seeing in movies and what was happening around the world fueled our imaginations for a technologically advanced future. Like others, I imagined a future with a Space Force and flying cars. So I clearly made the right choice in joining the Department of the Air Force. But the possibilities for the future seemed endless. Apple had just released its first personal computer aimed at household use, and it was groundbreaking. It came with 4 kilobytes of RAM and boasted the revolutionary feature of color graphics. Today, the Apple Watch on your wrist has about 8 million times that amount of memory, and also allows you to make video phone calls, for those of you who remember Dick Tracy. Another unique aspect of this machine was a program called VisiCalc. It featured a spreadsheet design that allowed the user to add rows of data and instantly provide calculations. Today, this feature is painfully familiar for budgeteers and programmers who still use pivot tables on Excel spreadsheets. But at the time, we were at the cutting edge of what would soon become the technological revolution. And as a young airman, I couldn't wait to be a part of it. Fast forward to today, and it's clear that we live in a very different world. Although I'm often dismayed that we still have a department in some ways familiar to the one I first joined. For instance, we've had an all-volunteer force since 1973, and despite changes in labor markets, technology, and generational values, the department has been relatively slow in evolving its personnel management practices. This is a challenge, because as the rest of society quickly adjusts, we were put at a disadvantage in recruiting top talent, particularly those with the digital skills we need today. Back when you and I joined, 2% of enlisted service members had a bachelor's degree. And today, nearly 10% of our enlisted force hold a bachelor's degree or higher. The other large shift we've seen is in the number of women who serve. In 1977, 6% of service members were women, even less 25 years earlier when my mother served in the Women in the Air Force program, or WAFs, during the Korean War. Today, that number is over 18% and growing. These are important statistics to understand because while the makeup of our force has changed dramatically, we are still essentially structured as that nascent all-volunteer force. Not only has our force changed over the years, but so has our strategic operating environment. In the 1970s, America was engaged in competition with one great power, the Soviet Union, which eventually succumbed to both internal and global factors. After the global war ended, our great power conflict muscles atrophied as we focused on counter-VEO operations. But today, the 2018 National Defense Strategy directs us to sharpen our competitive advantage over future threats. It describes a strategic environment categorized by a reemergence of great power competition, with now 2 near-peer competitors who can operate across all domains of warfare and simultaneously employ all aspects of their national power. All while we have a force today just half the size we had during Operation Desert Storm. In this environment, we must deal with extremely sophisticated systems such as advanced air defenses, hypersonic weapons, artificial intelligence, robotics, space, cyber, and digitized electronic warfare threats. The NDS demands we update our approach to account for these advancements. The Air Force continues to lead the way in this arena as it evolves to and prepares for the future. We see examples of this every day from airmen who are increasingly performing technically complex missions, and with the Space Force as they actively develop capabilities to make multi-domain operations lethal in, through, and from space. As you know, Secretary Esper is faithfully committed to implementation of the NDS. So when I started as the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, known as P&R in the building, I saw a great opportunity for us to lead the way in shaping the department into a data-driven, digitally modernized organization that the NDS demands us to be. Using this as a foundation, we've set our sights on the year 2030, looking at how to cultivate a technologically advanced future force that is strategically ready, globally relevant, and flexibly sustainable. The linchpin to this is digital modernization, to seamlessly connect all our data in real time. Looking over the horizon to 2030, it is clear a major conflict against China or Russia would take place simultaneously across every warfighting domain: air, sea, land, space, and cyberspace. In that vein, to build strategic readiness and increase lethality, it is absolutely critical we define the relationship between risk, time, and capabilities across all domains to ensure our total force can sustain the advantages necessary to deter or defeat any potential adversary. And of course, when I say total force, I'm talking about both military, active, guard, and reserve, and DoD civilians. In P&R, we're uniquely positioned to enable, guide, and assess military education and joint training and exercises for our men and women to hone the art and science of warfare and cultivate a globally relevant force. As a graduate of Class 7 of the School of Advanced Air Power Studies, I know firsthand the Air Force takes this seriously. Programs like SAS, SAMS, and SAWS develop critical thinkers and strategic leaders. And great leaders understand their first responsibility is to create new leaders to improve and sustain the enterprise. In P&R, one of my main responsibilities is to make sure that amid all this change, we enable, guide, and assess our ability to recruit, train, and retain the men and women necessary to ensure we remain the strongest military in the world. It's a big responsibility, and we have to get this right. So we're taking a close look at the attributes of the younger generations and evaluating against how we operate as a department. It's no surprise your incoming airmen are incredibly talented. They're diverse, innovative, and what I call digital natives, meaning they're from the generation that grew up with technology in their hands. It's their generation that could operate an iPhone often before they even started elementary school. This generation is the exact kind of talent we need to attract in our military and civilian workforce, but it's also the exact kind of talent our corporate competitors are trying to attract. The department is in a growing war for talent, so we must improve our talent management for the information age if we hope to have a joint force that will successfully deter and win future conflicts. One of these areas is the ability to appeal to the expectations that may be unique to this generation. What can we offer that would attract someone to join the military over a corporate job? I'm reminded of the value proposition of the Air Force that the Air Force extends to its members. The opportunity to work with amazing people, have access to cutting-edge technology, and make a difference for our nation. So while we may never match the salary of a Google, Apple, or some other modern industry, the calling to a noble profession is what enables our people to become self-actualized and find real meaning in their careers. Another aspect of talent management we must seriously consider is the ability for our people to move in and out of our different components, or even the civilian sector. Some people call this permeability of service, but really, it's about career flexibility and realizing individuals today have certain needs and expectations in their lives, and we have to meet those if we want to find and keep the best people. We must afford people the opportunity to move from active duty to the reserve and back to active duty. Sabbaticals should be the norm instead of the exception. And we must allow for breaks in service to raise a family, take care of aging parents, or to get additional education or experiences, and then welcome them back to active duty when their situation permits without penalty. Now, going back to the value proposition, while we definitely have the most amazing people who are patriotic and serve for a greater purpose, we fall short in some areas for their access to cutting-edge technology. But we can't just settle for 2 out of 3. So this leads me to my final point and the connective tissue that holds all this together, the imperative of digital modernization across the entire department. Since the Apple II was released in 1977, we have witnessed technology unleashed. Today, most of us carry phones in our pockets that have 100,000 times more processing power and over 7 million times more memory storage than the Apollo 11 had on board. As the world becomes more technologically advanced and interconnected, these trends will only increase. Moore's law tells us that the number of transistors on a CPU doubles every 2 years, while the relative cost will decrease at an exponential rate. Some contend artificial intelligence has pushed the world to outpace Moore's law. And for the DoD, these realities could have harsh consequences. Because some of our foundational analog practices, we're at risk of falling behind our competitors as they readily adapt to the speed of technology. The U.S. is certainly the most capable military in the world, but our adversaries know this and are aggressively pursuing ways to find gaps and seams to exploit vulnerabilities in ways not necessarily kinetic, but just as damaging. We cannot rule out in some cases our adversaries may already be at a level of technological overmatch. So the imperative to modernize for the digital future is central to my efforts for personnel and readiness. It begins by lifting our current workforce to a higher level of digital awareness and taking advantage of hiring new people who are digitally savvy. But we can only realize this vision by establishing a culture that is digitally centric, data-based, and results-driven. A lot has changed in the world since you and I raised our right hands for the first time. We now have 12 Star Wars movies. And Atari is releasing a new retro console inspired by their original version. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine these things would be considered retro, but I guess that just means I'm getting old. But for DoD and the Department of the Air Force, we have a great opportunity in front of us. There is a lot of work to be done, but it is our imperative to lay the foundation so future generations can operate as a technologically advanced force, empowered to be strategically ready, globally relevant, and flexibly sustainable. Thanks again, Chief, and thanks to AFA for having me here today. I look forward to the other presentation at this year's conference and to our discussion. Thank you very much.
All right, sir. Well, thank you so much. Well, the fact that you and I came into our Air Force at about the same time just means both of us are getting older. And the world still clearly has changed, as you so well articulated there. So to my first point then, an era, the time that you and I came into was the Cold War. That era is often characterized as the decades that resulted in a hollow force. Defense budgets and readiness numbers were historically low. And these were the conditions that set the stage for the defense buildups that came during the Reagan years. So with that, can you speak to some of the lessons from the Cold War era as we face the potential of declining budgets and growing threats moving into the future?
Well, that's a great question. And we have to learn from our past as we look forward to the future. But the American way of war is really grounded in our ability to project combat power anywhere on the planet. Back in the Cold War, we had major warfighting exercises over in Europe. One was called Reforger. You probably remember that, Return of Forces to Germany. These types of exercises reassured our allies and demonstrated this capability to our adversaries. It provided significant deterrent value. We're restarting these efforts. The Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs have articulated their focus on larger warfighting exercise that actually exercise our war plans that will not only demonstrate the capability, but exercise those muscles that have atrophied over the years. We've grown used to a rotational mindset, really since the end of Desert Storm, where we rotate small units in on mature infrastructure with a focus on that counter violent extremist organization. So it's something that we have to shift, and it's what the NDS has had us do. So, along with that, we need to ensure we have an industrial base, and specifically a defense industrial base that's able to support the force structure and can respond quickly in an emergency. My compadre Ellen Lord and Acquisition Sustainment has done great work on this front, and she has her eye on the needs of the force for both today and in the future and that eventuality. So it's a little bit of a mindset shift. The NDS has given us that impetus to do so. So we're on it.
All right. Well, my next question is really a direct follow-on to that point about the NDS. And the fact that you and I are both, veterans of Desert Shield, Desert Storm. We often talk about the fact that our Air Force has, and to much part, our nation has remained in combat operations in a high ops tempo, from that time frame into today. And yet we also know that our forces are much retracted from the size that they were there, while that mission has expanded at the same time that the force has shrunk in size. So the question then is, how can our services continue to meet everyday mission requirements while rebuilding to meet the demands of the current national defense strategy?
That's another great question that leaders historically always grapple with, both the service leaders and the Department of Defense leaders. They have to continually balance what I call the iron triangle: readiness, modernization, and force structure. And if one of those corners of the triangle gets out of whack with the others, then you incur increased risk. So, I believe the services are at a critical point to modernize and rationalize our force structure, not just the Air Force, but the other services as well. And they're moving out on doing that. But it's also is just the fact that we have to convince the 535 members of our board of directors across the river, and but they're reasonable people, and so it just takes educating and continual engagement with Congress to do that. I think we still have a window of opportunity. The threat is increasing every day, but I think we still have a window of opportunity to divest legacy force structure in order to modernize without incurring as much risk as we might in later years.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. All right. Another question. It goes back to your initial comments on the digital modernization. You speak of and really just how important it is for the Department of Defense. And we've heard from our Air Force leadership that one of the most dangerous things that we can do right now is to decide to continue to do business as usual. In fact, our new Chief of Staff has talked about the highest priority of accelerating change to be able to meet that. As the speed of technology gets faster every single day, there's a lot of processes that we need to change in order to keep up. So to that, what can we do to accelerate this and ensure that we don't fall behind?
Well, I'm really glad to see Chief Brown take over as Chief of Staff. I've known him for several years, and when I was over on the Hill, worked with him when he was down at CENTCOM, and he's the right guy for the right time. And I look forward to working with him and supporting him as he tries to move the Air Force forward here. Your question really gets to the essence of strategic readiness, which in my mind is the timely conversion of resources into warfighting lethality to deliver strategic outcomes. So to decide to do nothing is still a decision. But this is underpinned by having a technologically advanced force that can seamlessly connect decision quality information to the right people in real time. The Air Force's approach with the Advanced Battle Management System, AVMS, and its lead on the Joint All-Domain Command and Control. I believe that we have the right service working that. These are instantiations of these concepts, and we must extend the concept to every one of our other processes as well, too. The key is robust IT infrastructure, a data management strategy, and then the evolution of our workforce into a digitally savvy, data-centric culture, as I mentioned in my remarks.
Well, then that's a great point, and it brings me to the follow-on to that one as well. Everyone seems to agree that there are flat budgets ahead, and all of our services are struggling to reshape for the pure competition. But the Air Force is especially strained in this regard. How do you make the case for more airmen being an investment and not just a cost?
Well, I agree with you. There'll be substantial downward pressure on their defense budgets in the future, and that's really regardless of what happens in November and which administration comes in. It's just the fact of life. The COVID pandemic cost this nation a lot when it comes to its economy. So, Congress is trying to help us out with that. But there'll be a cost on the other end. We'll have to pay the piper on that one. So I think the key on investment for manpower and for the Air Force is we must be able to place the right people into the right jobs at the right time. So we have to transform our personnel management practices into a true talent management system, enabled by rapid data manipulation and exploitation. BK Kelly, the A1, is making some good progress with that, with trying to transform the Air Force's processes into true talent management systems. And, we're with them all along the way to make sure that we can enable and guide and assess that for him and transfer those lessons learned to the other services as well, too. The Army's also doing some incredible work with talent management. So the department's getting it. It's just we got to move out on it. We have to assimilate the importance of digital modernization and then cultivate a force that innately views all processes through this data-centric lens. It's a culture shift. We have pockets of excellence everywhere throughout the services within the DoD. We just have to tie them all together.
I agree. Well, you touched on the COVID environment that we are in. And I did want to ask one question related to COVID-19 as we start to wrap up. We've seen and heard a lot about all the work the department is doing in response to the pandemic. Now that we're a few months into this effort, can you speak to any lessons learned so far and how those are being applied across the services?
Well, there's several things. As you know, the Deputy Secretary has kicked off a lessons learned effort, if you will, and put some folks in charge of it. And I spent a lot of time with one of the folks last week who was asking a lot of these same questions. A quick story, on March 2nd, I had to leave the position I was performing the duties of for a couple of months, and then my nomination went over to the Senate. So according to the Vacancy Act law, I have to step out of the position while I was undergoing the nomination process. And that was March 2nd. I got confirmed on March 23rd, just 3 weeks later. And when I got back into the position, the whole world had changed. On March 10th, I had my confirmation hearing, and we were all still shaking hands and talking to each other, and social distancing hadn't become a thing at that point. So the whole world got turned upside down, as everyone who's listening to this certainly understands. But there were some really strong points of light in there. One was um, we were forced into teleworking. Well, prior to the COVID pandemic and the P&R workforce, which is quite a few people, we were at about 5% of the people were teleworking. And then, of course, when we were forced into doing it, we went to about 95%. And a lot of the skeptical people and skeptical supervisors, we're never going to go to a more robust teleworking environment. Well, we're still at about 70% teleworking today. And to be honest, I don't think we're going to go much lower than that in the future, because even though our workload remember, I have health affairs, I have manpower and reserve affairs. So anything that has to do with people and all the force health protection guidance that you saw come out of our office, I would say our workload tripled. But we were able to meet the workload even with the vast majority of people teleworking. So I think that's one lesson. The other lesson, I think, is COVID is a wake-up call to DoD, and it needs to ensure that we transform our practices to deliver decision quality information faster, which goes back to my really strong push for digital modernization. It forced us out of our comfort zone and pushed us into the digital area and teleworking and being able to transmit information back and forth. I think going forward, we can't afford to lose the lessons of that's shown us. And, but I tell you, I'm really proud of my folks. The very first time I even heard about this pandemic was back in about the middle of January. And my Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs called me on a Sunday afternoon and said, hey, this thing that's going on over in China, we probably need to get to the Secretary and put out some force health protection guidance. And we put out our very first force health protection guidance on the 30th of January. And just last week, I signed out the 13th supplement to that to make sure we're staying ahead of it. So I'm really proud of my folks. I'm proud of the way the services have stepped up and adjusted their processes, such as recruiting and accessions training. And, all the services are planning right now on making their end strength at the end of this month because they worked through it. But that's what the Department of Defense and the military services is all about adapting and moving forward and getting the mission done.
Well, you have a lot to be proud of in that regard, in the role that you have there. All right, I think we've got time, so I've got another question to kind of throw at you, but it's completely off the line because it's just between airmen. You and I both, as you highlighted, spent 3 decades of our service in our Air Force. In your formative years, you were a fighter pilot, and I was a fighter crew chief. And I've always found it interesting how how our pilots came about getting their call signs. And you certainly have a unique one, known as Gorilla. Would you mind sharing how that call sign came about?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that, the guy who was out in charge of that flight line was the crew chief. And he always warned me before I walked up that ladder, you bring this thing back, code 1, and in one piece, sir. And I would, absolutely. I just love the crew chiefs, and over the years, how many I had that took very loving care of the machines that we flew and also took care of us as well, too. There are 2 ways that you can get a call sign. One is like a natural that goes along with your name. And then one is because you screwed something up. And in my case, it was the latter. I was a young second lieutenant out on my very first red flag. And I was flying on the wing of a flight commander in the squadron. And he told me, look, your job is to, sort your target, take your shots, but above all, you never lose sight of me. And he says, if you lose sight of me, I want you to do a combat descent down. I want you to check 6 and get all the way back to what we call student gap, is where we started the fight from. And he said, because if you get shot, you're going to embarrass me, and I don't want you to embarrass me. And I'm like, okay. So, we push out on the first sortie. of the day out on that red flag. I'm sorting. I've got the radar going. I'm looking good. I'm looking over. I can see him. I'm feeling good about it. And then we get into the heat of the fight, and I look over and I don't see him anywhere. And I go, oh no, this is not good. So I executed what my plan was directed to do, which was do a combat descent down to 500 feet, beat feet all the way back to student gap, checking 6 the whole time so I don't get shot. The problem was, as I was looking behind me, checking 6 the whole time, I wasn't really looking in front of me. And I happened to go right down the middle of a package of air-to-ground folks and F-16s, and that's called a guerrilla package. And I never saw any of them and got back up and was real proud of myself that no one snuck up on me and shot me. And then in the debrief later, when you could see airplanes all going all different ways because this crazy F-15 pilot was flying right through the middle of them. So that's kind of the short version, but
That's gorilla always stuck. Well, that is just great. Well, sir, again, we can't thank you enough for the great words of wisdom on the important topic. And of course, your responsibility is the most important resource that we have, absolutely by far, and that's our people. And I can't tell you how proud we are and how honored we are to have an airman for life that is leading our Department of Defense's Office of Personnel and Readiness. So again, thank you so much for being a part of this year's virtual Airspace and Cyber Conference.
Well, thank you very much, Chief. And as I mentioned, I appreciate your long years of service, and I appreciate your leadership as chairman of the board for AFA. And so my best to all of you at this conference, and I look forward to viewing all of the discussions. Thank you.
Sir, thank you. And let me say thanks to all that have tuned in to watch this session on our strategic plan for personnel and readiness. Please be sure to visit the Air Force Association's booth in our exhibit hall. We're offering a special on half-price membership during our virtual conference. So we hope that you all will take advantage of that. If you're not already, as the good secretary and I are airmen for life. So thank you again, sir.
Thank you.